In my humble opinion, the Cold War was a long period of tension between the democratic countries of the Western Hemisphere and the communist countries of the East. The primary leader in the West was the USA, while the Soviet Union led communism's attempted spread across the globe. The Cold War consisted of the Soviet Union and the USA flexing their power through political forms and nuclear tests. There's many different conflicts that happened during the Cold War, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, leaders of the US and the Soviet Union engaged in a tense 13-day political and military standoff in October 1962 over the installation of nuclear-armed Soviet missiles on Cuba, just 90 miles from the US shores. There were other incidences, like the U-2 spy incident. An international diplomatic crisis erupted in May 1960 when the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR, shot down an American U-2 spy plane in Soviet airspace and captured its pilot, Francis Gray Powers. There was also other things happening during this time, like the space race, beginning in the late 1950s. Space would become another dramatic arena for this competition, as each side sought to prove the superiority of its technology, its military firepower, and by extension, its political economic system. There's also the domino theory. The domino theory was a Cold War policy that suggested a communist government in one nation would quickly lead to communist takeovers in neighboring states, each falling like a perfectly aligned row of dominoes. During the Cold War, NATO was also founded. In 1949, the prospect of further communist expansion prompted the United States and 11 other Western nations from the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Joseph Stalin, was the dictator of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics from 1929 to 1953. My court case was the New York Times Co. vs. United States. It was a landmark decision by the United States Supreme Court on the First Amendment. The Supreme Court ruled that the First Amendment did protect the right of the New York Times to print the materials. The materials it was later called the Pentagon Paper Case. The Nixon administration attempted to prevent the New York Times and Washington Post from publishing materials belonging to a classified Defense Department study regarding the history of the United States activities in Vietnam. The president argued that prior restraint was necessary to protect national security. This case was decided together with United States Washington Post Co. United States vs. Washington Post Co. Richard Nixon claimed executive authority to not allow the newspapers to print the confidential papers. The Supreme Court ruled in favor of the newspapers and fought against government censorship of the news. To get a better feel of the time period, I had a little brief interview with my father. Far too brief, I guess. I asked him how did the Cold War impact his day-to-day life, and he told me that they used to do drills where they'd hide under the desks in case of nuclear missile attacks from the Soviet Union. And there's a bunch of other things like that. He remembers like when we sent the first person onto the moon. He remembers all that. He's an old guy. And yeah, that wraps up our little thing here.